Let's talk about visualizing Scrum. A lot of you have a sketchy idea about Scrum, but it's not as robust as it needs to be at your level as a PMP or whatever you are as a project manager. Maybe you're not even a PMP, maybe you're a PM, maybe you're a project administrator, coordinator. It will still be great for you to know a little bit about Scrum. So let's visualize Scrum. I love this representation of Scrum from one of the co-creators of Scrum, Ken Schwaber, and he says Scrum hangs all of its practices on an iterative, you got to watch these words, iterative, done in iterations, and incremental process skeleton. So what exactly is Ken talking about? Well, this is represented very well in Ken's book, Agile Project Management with Scrum, where he breaks it down as simply as this. He shows a product backlog, which is a backlog of requirements. I'll just call that PL, product backlog, PBL, product backlog. Your product backlog is going to flow the requirements into an iteration. I'll just call it a sprint here. So the product backlog flows these requirements into the sprint to get done. And then we have the 24 DSU, 24-hour daily stand-up. I'll just call it DSU to abbreviate it. We have a daily stand-up meeting every 24 hours. And the bottom line is going through this sprint from anywhere. This is not advocated in his book, but typically people would say, oh, I want to do a sprint in anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks. That's a wide net. Most people go for 2 weeks, but ultimately your sprint is the vehicle within which you are creating that iteration of working software. And Ken calls this an increment of functionality. Some other people will call it a shippable product, incremental shippable product, but I will use his term, increment of functionality. And that's the idea. You're going to keep on increasing the functionality, going back, doing a replan of what is in the backlog. The team takes a section of it out, puts it back into the sprint, and keeps on going until you have many increments, many additions of functionality, and you get to the point where you have derived the value that the client is seeking. This is really like a skeleton of Scrum, but it starts off, as Ken says, with a vision of a system to be developed. So the big question mark, it starts off here. And I'm going to give you a more elaborate view of Scrum. This is the skeleton, but now let's expand on the skeleton. So how does it typically start off? It starts off with people identifying what they want. So it could start off with people saying, we have a need for something. We'll just say, I want whatever it is. Now, I want whatever it is fine, but if we're actually going to be able to develop it properly, we need to know why you want what you want. And this is where we introduce the concept of user stories. User stories. A user story is a user-centered statement for a requirement. Now, when you think of a user statement, it has to first of all declare who the user is as a, whatever you are. It could be as a teacher, it could be as an engineer, it could be as a student. As a, I would like, whatever you want, so that whatever need needs to be satisfied. And this is pretty much the model for your user story. Now, ultimately, you're going to have these users, these same folks over here, these same users, keep your eye on these users, these guys. You're going to have many of these user stories, a whole assortment of user stories. So I want you to think about these user stories, many of these user stories, having a look like this. So here's your user story, right? You got many user stories. Imagine having so many of them, so many of them. Now, you need to manage these user stories somewhere. Instead of just piling them up at random, we have a place where they belong. And this is where the entire idea about cataloging these user stories originates from. It's called a product backlog. So imagine your customers having all of these needs. They've got so many things they want, right? To see, they want to see all of these things in the system. So they end up transferring all of these needs into a product backlog. There's your product backlog. Don't lose sight of the fact that it came from these guys, but it didn't come from these guys directly. Instead of it going directly in here from them like that, no. There is an intermediary who stands in between what they think they want and what eventually gets put in here. And that person is called a product owner. The product owner knows the business, but at the same time, the product owner is someone who is balanced in their view, balanced in their opinion of what should actually get done first, based on what they know. Okay, so this is going to be your product owner. Product owner. And the product owner, like I said, is the intermediary between what the business wants and what actually gets put into the product backlog. So you're gonna hear quite a few terms. So keep your eye on the product owner. Now, I also want to invite you to download a free copy of what Ken and Jeff, co-creators of Scrum, have very kindly put out. It is known as the Scrum Guide. And in the Scrum Guide, they define the product owner as being someone who is responsible for maximizing the value of the product, resulting from work of the development team, the people who actually develop the end result. And I want to invite you to go to scrumguides.org and check out what they have there, okay? Check out what they have there. Because in scrumguides.org, you'll get a free download to the Scrum Guide that has a breakdown of all of this. So the product owner, this character right here, is the sole person responsible for managing this, the product backlog. Product backlog management includes clearly expressing product backlog items, these items, ordering the items in the product backlog, optimizing the value of the work the team performs, ensuring the product backlog is visible and transparent and clear, and ensuring the development team understands items in the product backlog to the level needed. So this is a key player. Crummy product owner, everything's going downhill. Just keep that in mind. So now you know the product owner. What happens next with this product backlog? Well, for the product backlog to be useful, we need to select some elements of the product backlog to get into the sprint to be done. So we have something known as sprint planning. And in sprint planning, we are going to plan what to do in the iteration. So we're going to take a subset of these and we're going to put them into a smaller backlog. And guess what that backlog is called? A sprint backlog. So you have a scenario that looks something like this. So the idea is very simple. You got your sprint backlog that is made up of items pulled from the product backlog, of course. And you have something that looks a little bit like this. remember, it's just a cross section. So it's a smaller section of your product backlog. You're going to take a few of those user stories, put them in a sprint backlog, and then that becomes the bulk of what you are doing in your sprint. So think about it like this. You put these into production. But like I said, there needs to be sprint planning taking place. So think about there being some planning here. Okay. So there's going to be a sprint planning meeting, and that helps you fine-tune what goes in there. So in the Scrum Guide, it says, the work to be performed in the sprint is planned at the sprint planning. This planning is created by the collaborative work of the entire Scrum team. So now I introduce you to yet another entity in this maze. We're going to refer to them as the Scrum team. Scrum team is a very important collection of individuals. Here is the Scrum team. So the Scrum team, these are the folks right here that make stuff happen, that get stuff done. So the Scrum team consists of the product owner, the development team, and the Scrum Master. You already know who the product owner is. So when we say Scrum team, just be aware that the product owner is viewed as part of the Scrum team. The Scrum team, those three entities, the product owner, the development team, and the Scrum Master. I will use this to refer to the development team in this instance, but be aware that the Scrum team is all of those. The dev team, the Scrum Master, who I have not introduced you to yet, and of course the product owner that I just showed you. But I'll use this to represent the development team. So think about it like this. The Scrum team consists of a product owner, the development team, and a Scrum Master. And Scrum teams are self-organizing and cross-functional. The idea of a self-organizing team to many is hard to understand. But the bottom line is this. Self-organizing teams look at everyone as an adult, and we believe the best in each other, and we believe that we will pick up our own weight. So it's a mindset. You gotta trust people. You gotta depend on the fact that they will do what they know they should, and they'll jump in to help each other. Self-organizing teams choose how best to accomplish their work rather than being directed by others outside the team. Cross-functional teams have all competencies needed to accomplish the work without depending on others that are not part of the team. The team model in Scrum is designed to optimize flexibility, creativity, and productivity. The Scrum team has proven itself to be increasingly effective for all the earlier stated uses and any complex work. Scrum teams deliver products iteratively and incrementally. So there is your team, so to speak. But when I refer to the team, sometimes I could be talking about the development team, and I'll tell you when I am. The development team consists of professionals who do the work. We call them, believe it or not, the pigs in Scrum. So bear that in mind. But the bottom line is you have sprint planning, and sprint planning is a Scrum event that helps the team understand what needs to be done in the sprint. The work to be performed in the sprint is planned here. The plan is created by the collaborative work of the entire team. Sprint planning is time boxed to a maximum of 8 hours for a 1 month sprint. For shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. So let us cut out one more entity that I want you to visualize as being a single person. And this is the Scrum Master. the Scrum Master. So I'm going to put the Scrum Master here. And from henceforth, we will use this image to represent the Scrum Master. So I hope you're getting the idea. Ultimately, you're going to get the user stories in the sprint backlog, and then what happens next? You begin to do stuff. Now, this is a very short representation of a much longer discussion, okay? But the development team works within the sprint to forecast functionality, and that's why I have a few charts behind. Don't get it twisted. It's not all about charts. But the Scrum Master should have a handle on how things are proceeding mentally. The Scrum Master does not manage the team. Like I said, it's a self-organizing team. But the Scrum Master should know the metrics, the measurements, the burn down charts, and things like that should be known by the Scrum Master. Now, as the project progresses, like I said, when I showed you the skeleton, we're going to have the sprint taking place, and we're going to have that cycle of work being done anywhere from, could be 1 week for some teams, it could be 2 weeks, which is like a sweet spot for some others. But ultimately, we're going to have this cycle taking place right here. And this is your sprint. Sprint of anywhere from, to be honest, it could be anything. It really depends on the team. And one of the things in the world of Agile and Scrum, we try not to lock people down into, it must be for 4 weeks or it must be for 5 weeks and things like that. No, we don't do that. So anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks. Could be more, could be somewhere in the middle. Okay. So now you begin to get an idea of what is happening. These folks are working, right? So as this is going on, these folks, they are getting work done. And one of the hallmarks of them getting work done is what is known as the daily scrum. The daily scrum. And the daily scrum, we're going to read from the Agile Practice Guide. So what is the daily scrum? It's a 15-minute time-boxed event for the development team. The daily scrum is held every day of the sprint. At the daily scrum, the development team, remember the development team, I told you some of them are going to be in here. The development team plans work for the next 24 hours. So the questions that are answered in the daily scrum are typically, what did you do yesterday? What will you do today? And what impediments are hindering you? Pretty much, okay? Paraphrased in my way. Now, the Scrum Guide defines these as, what did I do yesterday that helped the development team meet the sprint goal? What will I do today to help the development team meet the sprint goal? And do I see any impediments that prevents me or the development team from meeting the sprint goal? The development team or team members often meet immediately after the daily scrum for detailed discussions. So we take detailed discussions outside or to adapt or replan the rest of the sprint's work. So this is what goes on in your daily scrum. And when we say stand-up meeting, that's exactly what we mean. It is a daily stand-up. And the entire idea is that you have the pigs and the chickens. The chickens are those who are not working. They are free to join if they want, but they can't speak. The pigs, total sacrifice for the pigs, they can speak. So it goes back to the story about the chicken the hen and the pig. They're walking by a diner and they see breakfast, eggs and bacon. And the chicken says, let's go in there. And the pig says, nope, not me. For you, it's just a donation. For me, it's total sacrifice. So the idea is that these guys are sacrificing a lot of their work, effort, time, everything to get the incremental shippable product. So we have the pigs and the chickens. Chickens can't speak, pigs can. Okay, so ultimately, when all is said and done, after the development team, the Scrum team, they work, they get everything done, at the end of the sprint, they are going to obtain a shippable product increment. And that shippable product increment is just one increment of many to get these guys to their goal, which could be many iterations of this. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10, whatever it is. But ultimately, they want to get the final assortment of user stories that gives them that value. Okay? And that's the idea behind it. So they are going to get out, like I said, a shippable product increment. And that's the idea behind Scrum. That's pretty much it. It's a very, very lean but mean framework. Now, this is not the only thing that happens. There are many other tiny little nuances that you guys should be aware of, okay? So I've talked about the sprint, okay? Just to give you context. I've talked about the sprint. I've talked about sprint planning that happens here, sprint planning. I've talked about the daily Scrum. And we've got 2 more things to talk about before we entirely wrap this up. 2 things happen. So those are my friends from the world of predictive. What happens at the end of a project? What should you do as a good project manager? You should have a lessons learned. What else should you do at the end of a phase? Or let's say at the end of a project, as many of us know. Well, we should inspect. Well, that is what comes next. We're going to have a stage where we inspect. And the Scrum Guide talks about the sprint review that is held at the end of each sprint to inspect the increment and adapt the product backlog if needed. And during the sprint review, the Scrum team and stakeholders collaborate about what was done in the sprint based on that and any changes to the product backlog. But there's one more thing that we need to talk about. It's called a retrospective. What do we do in the retrospective? We look back in the rearview mirror. We try to take a look at what could be done better. And who's going to benefit from this? Of course, the Scrum team. So one more cycle that needs to happen here of events, of things. This is our sprint retrospective. So we're going to have a sprint retrospective. So what exactly do we do in the sprint retrospective? It's an opportunity for the team to inspect itself and create a plan for improvement. The sprint retrospective occurs after the sprint review and prior to the next sprint planning. Now, this stage right here, the sprint review, that happens before it, let's just say sprint review, is also one you want to keep your eye on, okay? The sprint review includes the following elements. Attendees include the Scrum team and key stakeholders that the product owner may invite. in the sprint review. The product owner explains what backlog items have been done. So in other words, which items from this have actually been done. And it's not all of these. A lot of times, some of the items may not be done in the sprint backlog. The entire group collaborates on what to do next. So the sprint review provides valuable insight to subsequent sprint planning. And a review of the timeline, the budget, potential capabilities, and so on is also talked about. Okay. And don't forget that when all is said and done, you are going to go back to the drawing board to plan the next sprint. There may be cases where you cancel a sprint even before the time box is over, and for various reasons. And that's why I would advise open up the Scrum Guide. It's free. Go to scrumguides.org and read up a little bit more about this. One of the other things that I did not address is the fact that what you have created, the potentially shippable product increment, will also be demoed at some point. So as part of the sprint review, and this has a lot of sensitivity associated with it, so be aware that this is not a formal Scrum event, but people often refer to the demonstration of the shippable increment known as, they call it a sprint, or maybe not even a sprint. They often just refer to this casually as a demo. Some people call it a sprint demo. It is not a legitimately recognized Scrum event, but it could be viewed as part of the sprint review. And this is where the software or the system or whatever it is demonstrated. And on Ken's website, you'll see an article that says the sprint review is much more than just a demo. So the sprint review is not just a demo, but the sprint review is conducted for collaboration purposes. It's all about collaborating. It's about an opportunity to inspect and adapt. And that's part of why we talk about the minimum viable product as well, you know, surrounding your shippable product increment. It should be an event where you can collaborate, where you can learn, where you can not only inspect, but where you can also adapt. You inspect the sprint, the product backlog, the increment, the marketplace, the budget, the timeline, the capabilities, and you adapt the product backlog and the release plan. So these are just some of the ideas, okay? And I hope that gives you some clarity on what exactly happens in the world of Scrum. It's a very short one, it's a very quick one, but I hope to bring you some more videos about the world of Scrum. Okay, thank you very much for your audience. I wish you all the best in your Agile project management, your Scrum, whatever you're working on. Take care and bye for now.